Now what we are going to focus on is preparations, recognition, and prevention. And so what we have in this section is kind of talking about your physical, your emotional, and even your mental response to a situation such as an active shooter encounter or experience. And so, of course, we are hoping that none of you ever experienced this, but with this field of being in security and focusing on safety and taking this commitment, we want to make sure that you understand how to be aware of your own self, if that makes sense. And so I'm sure a lot of you have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. At one point in time, it was just fight or flight. But what happened over time with the development, with medical, with theories that are developed in the medical world, is that fight or flight was very confining, meaning that it boxed individuals in and it wasn't really encompassing the entire experience of someone physically responding to a scary situation. And so what we find is that fight means that, yeah, you're going to do whatever you have to do to make sure that you are safe and that you're alive. Basically is what that means. You're going to give it all that you can to make it out of that situation. Flight simply means that you are fleeing that situation. You are doing your best to avoid it by any means. And freeze, exactly what it says. You freeze. You stop. You are not moving. Your thoughts, everything you basically have blanked out or blacked out for that matter. Okay. And so the question that we always ask is, in your role, do you think you should react or respond in your role in the security field? So if there's a crisis situation, do you think that we expect you to respond or react? And so if you've never heard of this, please take note of it. And what I'll tell you, we'll watch the video first, and then I'll answer that question here at the end.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson. Today I'm going to talk about the fight or flight reaction. This is one of my favorite videos on YouTube. This is from youtube.com/Russia Today. So we got this person here walking down the street. All of a sudden they realize there's a car coming, and then they get out of the way. Now, if I were to keep playing it, the guy jumps out of the car, comes running in this direction. But basically, I want to talk about what's going on. So once this guy sees the car, how does he, number one, get out of the way? And then how does that affect his body? How does that affect the organs and the chemistry and all of that inside his body? And so that whole thing is called the fight or flight. And so when I ask students, how does he get out of the way of the car? The answer is always adrenaline. And the right answer is no, it's not adrenaline. Adrenaline's not going to be able to get there that quickly. And so how does a guy really get out of the way? Well, he's going to see the car coming. He's going to process that in his brain, and then he's going to send a message down his nervous system. That nervous system is going to be attached to muscles, and those muscles are going to have ATP ready to go. And so the way he's able to jump out of the way and not get hit by the car doesn't have anything to do with the fight or flight response. It's simply his nervous system, his muscles, and just responding to that threat immediately. But if you've ever been in a situation like that where you just barely survive an accident or something like that, all of a sudden you feel this rush of just your heart starts beating faster, you're breathing, you feel warm. Now that's part of the fight or flight response, because this guy right here, since he's living in a city, is able to just kind of walk back onto the road and keep about his business. But back in the day, if you were attacked by a mountain lion or somebody else, you had to fight now. You had to flee, or you had to attack the attacker. And so all of that is part of what's called the sympathetic nervous system, or that system inside our body that allows us to fight or flight. And so let's zoom inside this guy and talk a little bit more about how the fight or flight works. And so it's basically centered around his brain. And so in the center of his brain, near the bottom, we have something called the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus in that area of the brain is essentially going to send a signal. Now that signal, not only are we getting signals that are going to the muscles that allow you to move, but it's going to send a signal all the way down, a nervous signal all the way down here. Because in the center of our adrenal gland, we have something called the adrenal medulla. It's connected nervously to the brain. So the moment he sees that car and realizes he might die, there's a signal being sent to the adrenal medulla, or the center of the adrenal gland. It's going to give off what's called adrenaline, and that adrenaline is epinephrine. Epinephrine is a chemical signal that is going to be attached to the circulatory system, and so it's going to course through the body. So as his heart beats faster and faster and faster, epinephrine is going to flow throughout the rest of the body. Now, epinephrine is not going to go into the cells of the body. It's simply going to, if we say this is a big liver cell, it's simply going to bind to proteins on the surface of those cells. And so what's it going to do to the liver? Well, in the liver, what it's going to do is it's going to trigger a signal transduction pathway that's going to convert glycogen that's found inside the cells of the liver, and it's going to release that as glucose. Why is it doing that? Well, glucose is our energy supply, and so now glucose is going to be coursing through our body along with epinephrine, and so now we have a supply of energy so we can quickly break down that glucose, get ATP, and we can do more out of it. But what's interesting is that epinephrine is going to go other places in the body, and it's going to have different responses depending on where it goes. And so what is epinephrine going to do to the cells that are in control of the breathing, the cells of the lung? It's going to speed up that breathing rate. What's epinephrine going to do when it goes to the cells of the heart? It's going to speed up the rate of the heartbeat. And so it's going to trigger a signal transduction pathway in the heart that's very similar to the signal transduction pathway that we find in the liver cells. However, it's going to have a different response inside the cells. It's going to not release glucose, but it's going to increase the rate of the beating of those cardiac cells. What do you think it would happen to the digestive system? Well, epinephrine's going to go there. Epinephrine's going to go there as well. But what it's going to do is it's going to vasoconstrict, so it's going to slow down digestion. And so it's going to slow down those blood vessels that feed those areas that allow us to break down and digest food, because when you're getting out of the way of a car or fighting an attacker, you don't really need to concentrate on breaking down that bagel that you ate for breakfast. So it's going to shut that down, but it's going to go to the muscles of your body and it's going to vasodilate, and so it's going to move more blood to those areas. And so our whole body is designed so we can have one signal, that epinephrine, but it can have all these different responses throughout the rest of the body. And so that's going to allow our body to respond to that threat, and that's why your heart races, you breathe faster, your pupils dilate, all that happens, and you can thank epinephrine for that. And it's that chemical response and the different either gene expression or signal transduction pathways that we have as a result. And so I hope that's helpful.
All right, so I hope that you enjoyed that video. And so after watching it, if you recall, I asked the question on if you think that you should react versus respond. And so the correct answer is that we want you to respond in a crisis situation and not necessarily react. Now, I'll break it down for you. When we talk about react, right, we think of a reaction. We're human, so naturally we're going to have an instant reaction, right? But in this role, we need you to have the ability to identify that feeling of the reaction and, so to speak, put it in check and allow yourself to rely on your training. So when we talk about respond, when you respond, that simply means that you are relying on your training to choose the most appropriate method that you've been trained to do, and that is also the safest protocol to align yourself with at that time. So an example that I'll give that is completely opposite of the security field to hopefully give you a better understanding of react or respond, or react versus respond, is, let's say, and this is no judgment to anyone, let's say you are at home and your child or your niece or nephew, and maybe they're 2 years old, is watching TV, and you walk and you stump your toe and you use some colorful language, right? Well, that's your reaction. You stub your toe, the pain hit, it hurt, and you said what you said, right? You didn't take a moment to assess the room, to see that your nephew was around, to say, maybe that's not what I want him to hear, or your son, your daughter, whatever. That is what react is. That's a reaction. It's just instant. There's really no thought process. You're not really assessing the space that you're in. You're just reacting, right? Responding would look like this. You stub your toe, you kind of say, oh, he's on the couch, and you say another word to replace the colorful language, right? In that brief second, you realize that your reaction was not appropriate for this moment, right? That is the level of awareness that we are expecting you all to have. To have that ability to say, okay, I felt it, I hear it, but this is what I have to do. This is the best method. This is the proper protocol. This is what I've been trained to do. Okay? And so let's go to our next slide. And so, sorry there. So our next slide is going to add on to that and simply say that there are 4 areas that you want to make sure that you are aware of and that you use this when there is a crisis situation such as an active shooter. So stay, assess, know, and learn. So always stay alert and remain aware of your surroundings. That is a day-to-day behavior. You should always remain alert. You should always know what's going on around you. You should always be aware of the movement. And the longer that you work, you will be aware of different individuals that work there, their shifts, their uniforms, just the general movement. You may also become familiar with the different cars in the parking lot. Who parks where, what type of car parks here, what type of, decal is required for the vehicles, if that's what the site requires. Just being aware so that when something is different, you know how to respond appropriately, okay? In the event that there is a crisis, you want to make sure that you assess your environment. So in order to do that, you need to know that before the crisis situation takes place. So quickly assess the nearest exits, the evacuation routes, wherever you are, and the best places to hide. A lot of times, sites and facilities rearrange things. The buildings are renovated and things are in constant movement. So that is something, again, that you have to do before the crisis situation. Or let's say there's some construction going on site and maybe some of the exits and routes are no longer available. You have to make sure that you are familiar with the new alternative routes, right? Because when a crisis is happening, we don't have time to say, hey, since the front door is locked, what door do we use now? That's something that we should have known already, okay? Know key components of your facilities, your emergency response plans. So every site, again, is going to have some type of EMP, so emergency ERP, emergency response plan. Some places call it an EMP, which is emergency management plan. And then also your evacuation routes. And then most importantly, learning your warning signs and red flags. Go with your gut. Go with what you've been trained to do. In the event that you're not sure about it, ask questions, document it, follow up. Make sure that you're doing everything you can before the crisis happens. One other thing that I want to add also, actually I'll go back, is that when it talks about assess, you want to make sure that in the event that there is an active shooter that is present at your site, at your location, you always need to determine if you are safer where you are versus running to an area that maybe you've been trained to do. You'll have to be able, if you can determine if the shooter is inside the building or outside the building, then you're able to determine the hopefully the best method and the best approach to it. But when you don't know, and when you're unsure, maybe the bullets have an echo, or maybe you're just so far away you really can't tell. Sometimes you are safer where you are versus running into the unknown, which could be open gunfire. Okay? And so here what we have is cover versus concealment. So I highly recommend, if you've never heard of this, that you pause it for a moment, read each bubble to make sure that you understand. And so effective covering is often hard to find. Therefore, constantly assessing your safety and safe spaces always remains a priority. When we talk about covering, we simply want you to be able to find a place where you are able to hide yourself from the shooter. Okay? When we talk about concealment is an object that the shooter can't see you, and it also limits the entry of bullets. So when we talk about concealment, we are talking about a large piece of furniture, some type of wall that you're behind, desk that you're behind, that are allowing you to hopefully limit some bullets from coming through that. It's very important for you to understand that. When we think about restrooms and you think about the pipings in the wall and what can happen in that situation. So you just want to make sure that, again, this is something that you're assessing at your site before a crisis ever happens. Okay, but be aware that sometimes, depending on what you're hiding behind, if it's not large enough, if it's not dark enough, if it's not isolated enough, it could be very easy to identify you. So these are things that you have to think through, that you have to process when you go through OJT, if that's something that your site does, when you have some communication with your supervisor after completing this training, or if you're in live training. This is a moment to have dialogue about where areas where you could cover yourself and items in your site that could be used as concealment. All right, we're going to stop there and then we will come back for practical responses.